Creative Journeys is your go-to podcast for all things creativity. I'm your co-host, Dave Petrosky, chair of the Communication, Media, and Screen Studies Department.
And I am your co-host, Melanie Odive, Venezuelan designer and educator. This is the podcast about creativity, what it is in its many forms, and how we can become more creative in our everyday lives.
All right, so hello, everyone. We're back at the start of March.
Oh my God, it's March already.
I know, it's crazy. And we're quickly approaching midterm, which is crazy also because it just seems like it flew, partly because we've been socked by snow. And I mean, I'm just sick of seeing snow at this point.
Well, I am not sick. I love snow. But last week I did have a moment of like, what am I supposed to do with all of this snow days?
Yeah. Well, I can't park on the street still because they plowed it and all of the parking spots are taken. So now I have to like share a driveway and we don't coordinate our time very well. So I have to get up at like 3 hours earlier than I normally do so that I can move my car because I'm always the last one in. But I'm always the last one out. But my car is the first one in the the end of the driveway, so I had to like move it and park it over here and then walk back, and it's just it's a pain in the neck. So I'm looking forward to just sort of a meltdown.
Well, I saw someone told me this morning that it's going to be 70s.
It's
next
coming.
week.
The rain is coming too.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's going
to be rain all week.
Yeah. But we're not here to talk about what rain.
That's right.
We might.
We could talk about rain, but we're delighted to have Dr. Stephen Brady here, who is an associate professor here in the biology department at Southern Connecticut State University. And we're going to do our normal thing, which is to allow you to introduce yourself rather than have us, sort of
read a little fact sheet
read
about
a fact sheet or something like that. So
I was just going to read the fact sheet.
Take it away, Stephen.
I don't know. Like you said, I'm here in the biology department at Southern. I've been here. This is my 9th year, and I never thought I'd be here for more than like 2.
Wow. Okay.
So here I am.
Yeah.
Our lab, I'll talk a lot about probably the research that we do because that's a really central part of the experience I have here in trying to create research opportunities for students and really understand aspects of the natural world, especially as it intersects with human activities. Yeah. So in the lab, we study amphibians. This is why I mentioned rain. So we're coming up on our field season, which for us is this once a year opportunity to collect data. As individuals that study wild populations, we're kind of timed to their reproductive cycle, and we study a species called the wood frog, which is this really widely distributed amphibian. It goes everywhere from Georgia roughly up to Alaska. And so it's got this huge distribution across this really wide range of conditions. And it's a very common amphibian in the Northeast. And for better and worse, it only breeds once in the spring in these often tiny little ponds. And so the timing of their reproduction activity is really tied to the spring thaw. So we have all the snow on the ground right now. Yeah. But in days, it's going to start raining. And that might be the trigger for these animals to come out of their hibernation. They show up in mass into these breeding ponds. So these ponds go from completely silent, iced over little puddles on the ground to just teeming with frog activity.
Sounds intense.
Overnight. It can be very intense.
Are those, okay, Jay, I feel like you're going to have to put a picture of a wood frog on the video for our listeners to be able to see what it is, but are they the tiny
that's about
little?
Right. They're a little bigger than that. They're about 10 to 20 grams. So I don't know what a good analogy is, but they're about yay big.
Okay.
Matchbox car.
Yeah, maybe a little. That's good for the females are a little bit bigger than that. The males tend to be more matchbox car size, and the females a bit larger. And they show up in these mass migration events. So right now they're all under the snow, and they have this remarkable adaptation. So with that distribution all the way up to really northern latitudes, in fact, they're one of few amphibians found north of the Arctic Circle. They have this amazing capacity to freeze solid in the winter. So most amphibians will survive the winter.
What do you mean resell?
they'll freeze completely solid. They'll turn into blocks of ice. Basically.
Oh.
So generally the strategy for amphibians that are ectotherms, right? They're responding to whatever the external temperature is. That's more or less their temperature.
Right.
So for the winter, most amphibians would freeze and not be able to tolerate that. They typically will burrow down beneath the frost line if they're terrestrial, like salamanders. Or if they're aquatic, they might go into the bottom of a pond and hang out in the muck where it doesn't freeze. Wood frogs and a few other amphibians kind of just don't care. They're just like put their middle fingers up and they hunker down under the leaf litter and they just like bring it.
So that's sort of like in comparison to like Florida having the iguanas like dropping out of trees and stuff like that, right?
What's going on with them dropping out of trees? Is that?
Well, they freeze. So when the temperature drops to like 30 degrees, it's so cold for them that they just freeze. And if they're too high up on the trees, they may just drop because of the wind. And
do they survive?
they survive.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
They survive. They're completely fine.
But they're like in paralysis.
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of people
but
get
that's-
worried because they're in paralysis. So maybe when they land, they didn't land in the most appropriate position. So people get scared. But over there, they constantly remind you the iguanas are fine. You just have to let them be, or maybe if you're super concerned, just move it to an area that is a little bit more covered up.
Okay.
So as they start feeling the temperature go up, they'll reanimate.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that. I always say I'm a terrible biologist. I know like a reasonable amount of information about one species. And I'm like, oh, tell me about the
You're a
iguanas.
specialist.
Like,
That's
a special generalist, I guess.
Well, I mean, I know this because I lived in Florida for like 19 years.
yeah.
But otherwise,
Yeah, it's sort of a niche kind of a thing to know.
I should know these things. I go to conferences and sometimes there'll be like trivia events where it's a like name that species. There'll be a photo on a screen and people try to guess like which plant or which animal or which geography it is. And it'll be kind of like trivia bonding night, and I'm always on the worst contributor. I'm like, do we just go like play some music now, or like you guys still want to do science? It's 10 o'clock at night. Sometimes I get psyched like that, but I don't have that breadth of knowledge. I feel like a terrible naturalist.
I wouldn't sweat it.
It's okay, right? Like I have a job, and I do,
Yeah, well,
I do
that's
okay
right,
research,
that's right.
but,
listen,
like, I'm not
don't
the
know
type of
everything
person
about
who
graphic
knows-
design.
Knows it all.
Yeah. Well, I've
always been like more interested in lots of different things than any one thing.
Well, but I think that's what I mean, that's what makes things interesting, right? Like, is being able to draw connections and like put, because I mean, if we only like did like biology exclusively and not anything else, well, there's a sense of not being relatable, right? And I think that well, I don't know, maybe this is taking it into too serious of a direction, but I think that might be a part of the problem with science communication at this point is that scientists quite frequently would fall into the realm of not necessarily having a breadth of experience and then not be able to articulate across venues about the importance of what they're studying. So when we talk about things like climate change, or at least when climate change was first getting talked about, it was positioned as almost, like scolding and that kind of stuff. And that, turned a lot of people off. And then it became, sort of this whole political thing, which got a life of its own. And I think
Everything is political.
Oh, well, of course, but that's true. I think that might be something that's connected to, just having the breadth of experience, right? And knowing something about a lot of areas. I mean, this is like the whole argument for liberal arts, isn't it, right? So, having some sort of breadth of knowledge so that you could take what you're concentrating on or what your specific thing is about and then being able to relate it to lots of other things.
And it's what we love to do the most here at Creative Journeys, right?
That's exactly right.
We learn so much with every guest that comes in, like I would never look up wood frogs on my own.
I take a little issue with that, but no, I wouldn't have learned that about iguanas. That's a good thing to exchange information on.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, just the idea of sort of exploring that that one species, it has so much broader implication. Like as you started to talk about, and then we kind of got distracted, but but I think there's so much that we can learn from the way that this particular species is adapting and not just surviving, but in some cases thriving, I guess. I don't know,
in some cases, in others failing to thrive, for sure.
Yeah.
I think there's often this premium, and I struggle with this. There's this premium on what can we learn about this for our own society, and I think that's valuable. But I don't love that there is this pressure to make a direct connection between our actions as scientists and the direct benefit to society.
Right.
And I think we used to believe in it. Right? We used to have this sense that science is good for society. We inherently know that. And we now have lots of data to back that up. For every dollar invested in NSF, it's something like 100x return over some number of years. Like the dollars spent by the taxpayer on science are paying back into society. But as scientists, we're not necessarily thinking about how can I optimize this study system or this question to directly benefit humankind in some way. And I don't think scientists flourish in that way. I think scientists flourish when they're given this creative space where you say, you're the folks who are out there looking at the questions, experiencing nature, making the observations, coming up with hypotheses. Do your thing. We know that it's going to help society. And I think that faith in science has been lost. And I think there is this pressure for how is your study of road salt pollution on the wood frog going to help me?
Right.
And really simply, I can say we shouldn't put down so much salt. End of story. That's so obvious. And I guess I didn't preface this. We study salt pollution primarily from these snowy winters and even when it's not snowy, we put down a tremendous amount of salt to de-ice roadways, driveways, sidewalks, parking lots, all of that. And that's just one source of this broader problem that we see emerging, which is freshwater salinization. So many of our freshwater habitats are becoming salty because of human activities. Climate change with rising sea level, agricultural practices, de-icing, industrial practices, mining, these all are creating inputs of salt into otherwise freshwater bodies. And we see these little ponds that I was talking about, these kind of grand puddles out there on the landscape, which I find just fascinating. These beautiful little habitats that go from dead silent to this uproar of breeding activity in the spring. Those animals don't exist without these little wet patches on the ground. And sometimes they're the size of this room. And there'll be a dozen frogs that breed there, or 24 frogs. If it's 10 times the size of this room, there might be 500 frogs that breed there, laying hundreds of thousands of eggs in these ponds, supporting a whole ecosystem. And that sort of gets back to the human component of this is part of our ecosystem. And sure, if the wood frog went extinct tomorrow, would our economy collapse and our health system break down more than it already is? No, but it would have ramifications and certainly big impacts. But I think the more important message is that this is part of the world we live in, and we should be allowed to study it and excited about it and want to conserve it. And so I think we have there's this pressure to directly relate our efforts to societal improvement, which puts us in conflict as scientists. We're not necessarily trained to do that. We think a lot about it when we write papers. We always try to make this connection to something more applied. But again, I think scientists thrive when they can just follow their noses and be curious and go out and do the things that they're inspired to do, which for me is putting on a pair of waders and going in these ponds and trying to figure out why and how salt pollution is compromising these populations and how they're able to adapt if possible. And we're actually finding a lot of examples where they seem to be unable to adapt to these conditions. And so we're trying to understand that on basically every biological level, from gene expression and the genome changes itself up to population changes. I think that's where this sort of creativity thing feeds into science in one capacity, is that let scientists do science in a way that they can express their interests and desires. That's really a creative thing. And I never thought about it historically in my life as like science being a creative act. But when you step back and you realize that you are creating knowledge through some sort of like idea and inspiration, something that didn't exist before, you're bringing it to the world, which to me is really cool. Like I love that part of my job. I love that part of my life. And it's, you know, we're coming up on the season when these animals are going to come out of this overwintering state where right now they're like little popsicles out there.
Right.
And soon they're going to thaw and then go into this big breeding frenzy. And as I was saying earlier, you know, we get one shot a year. This is a once a year event. We don't have colonies in the lab where we can say like, oh, let's do a breeding experiment next week. We'll just, you know, go and get the frogs to breed. And there are labs set up like that. We don't have that at Southern, and most people study other species for that, more of like lab rats of amphibians. That would be nice if we could eventually get there in my lab to have some sort of breeding colony. But we rely on the natural populations to do all of our data collection. And so with my lab right now, I have a great group of students who are working on and analyzing data from last year. They're writing papers, they went to conferences, and they're gearing up for this spring field season again. And we have about a month to get ready. We're studying populations in Vermont primarily. The Connecticut populations breed sooner, so they'll probably start breeding next week. So once the snow melts, keep an ear out. Maybe you've heard these frogs in the spring.
Are these frogs somewhere else in the States? Like, so in Florida, for example, do they also breeding the same time?
Yeah, these particular wood frogs don't go quite that far south, but the ones in say Georgia, South Carolina have probably already started breeding weeks ago. So you get this kind of this front that moves from south to north.
I'm trying to think because so I went to college in Palm Beach Gardens, and I lived with my grandparents. And for the longest time, ever since I can remember being a child, in my grandparents' home, we will always get this colony of little frogs that would just cover the entire front door, cover the garage. And it was always like a very specific time of the year. But, you know, me not being interested in biology, but the arts, I never really like went to research about it. But now that you're saying all of this, my brain is just like circling. I'm like, could this be wood frogs or some sort of like cousin or family? Because he had a huge pond in his front yard, and in the backyard we had not like an intercoastal, but like there were alligators in the back. So it was that big of of another water outlet. So there were many water areas where these frogs could have lived. And they were all like really like small, like just varying size, but small. But there were hundreds. And sometimes I couldn't even go in the house, and I had to call my grandfather and be like, the frogs are outside. I need you to open the door and just like shoo them so I can have a little pathway to go in.
Wow, it sounds kind of dreamy to me, but others might
I was thinking, I'm like, you would love it there.
I would love that. Yeah.
But now I'm wondering like how many different types of frog families or breeds
There's so
are
many.
there?
I don't know what the numbers are, but in Connecticut we have, I think, at least a dozen different species of frog. And if anyone listens to this, they'll probably criticize me for not knowing this number right away. But there's a lot of amphibian diversity. Other parts of the world have more. The tropics have a lot more per kind of unit area, but we have quite a high number of amphibians. In Florida, that may have been, it wouldn't have been the wood frog, almost certainly. That's a little bit south of their range. So it may have been the coqui is a frog that's common down there. I think the Cuban tree frog might be over there as well.
I have no idea what a Cuban tree frog is.
Oh, they're very
To me, there's only like little frogs, medium frogs, and the big toads.
This would be a medium frog. So
that would be a medium frog.
Yeah. We have toads around here. We have a few different species. There's a species that's more inland. There's also a coastal species that does quite well with sandy habitats and more saline environments. So amphibians kind of, I think most people have this impression that they're very sensitive to salt as a freshwater organism, and many of them are, but some of them are quite well adapted to salty environments. The species that we study, the wood frog, is generally not adapted to salt water. So those little ponds or grand puddles out there in the forest, are effectively rainwater. And if you were to look at the concentration of ions in that water, it's very, very low. So we tend to measure it on a scale of conductivity, which is a measure of electrical resistance in the water. And as you add salt, water gets more conductive. So it's a really good, quick measure of the amount of salt in the water out there. And we've done this for hundreds of ponds across New England. And we find that in these woodland ponds, away from the influence of roads and parking lots and driveways, the value that we measure is generally around 30, 20, 10, 40, 50, somewhere in there. In the roadside ponds where there's a lot of salt pollution, that number is 500, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000. So, and for reference, Long Island Sound on that same scale is about 28,000, and the unit is microsiemens of electrical resistance. So that's very salty. The ocean is closer to 40,000. Long Island Sound has a lot of freshwater input from rivers, so it's a little more dilute than the ocean. But these habitats that are typically completely fresh with almost no salt in them are now approaching maybe 10% of what we'd consider to be brackish water, which for these amphibians that breed in fresh water, it's a completely different environment. So it causes effects on survival, developmental rates change, growth rates, malformations. One of the most striking phenomena we've seen is that the wood frogs that breed in these roadside ponds will get incredibly bloated. So they're experiencing what we call edema, and they truly look like little water balloons, and that's not typical. So you have this kind of like image of this little frog that's hopping around. That's what they're supposed to look like. Some of the ones that are breeding in these polluted roadside ponds, when they come out of their winter hibernation, they're completely full of water inside their lymphatic system. And so it truly looks like someone took a syringe and just inflated them. And they'll be carrying sometimes up to 100% of their body mass as excess water. And that's one focus of the lab group right now, is really trying to understand the source, the cause of that. We know it's tied to salinity. So the saltier a pond, the higher the incidence of this edema that we find in it. We know that it compromises their ability to move. So we've done studies and tested their locomotion, both jumping and swimming, because these are animals that live in aquatic environments as tadpoles. And then as adults, they spend most of their time in the terrestrial world, hopping around and eating worms and bugs. And then they come back to the ponds where they're swimming and competing for access to mates, so that they have locomotion for both terrestrial and aquatic environments. And we see that this edema compromises both. So they don't jump as well, they don't swim as well. We've done experiments where we've measured their jumping and swimming performance before and after alleviating that edema. And you can quite easily at what we call aspirate, or to extract the fluid from these animals, just by piercing a small hole in the side of their skin. And if you put a little pressure on the frog and you do that, you'll see a geyser of fluid come squirting out. And that's completely abnormal. And so as best we can tell, this edema problem is strongly linked to salt, right? The saltier the pond, the more frogs look like little water balloons. And it seems to be occurring sometime in the winter when they're in this frozen state. Because when we go out in the spring and catch these animals, often we use these things called pitfall traps, which is kind of a fun field biology thing, where we put a fence around the pond. And it doesn't have to be terribly high. These animals jump, but they don't jump like 5 feet. But we'll put these 2-foot tall fences around the pond, and then every 10 or so feet, we'll dig a hole and put a 5-gallon bucket in the ground and sink that bucket flush with the ground. So the idea is, these animals are very excited to go breed after being frozen all winter. They hop toward the pond, they hit the fence, and then they try to go left or right, and they fall in a bucket. So it's one of these techniques we use to capture frogs. So they're called pitfall traps, like that old video game Pitfall. Remember that? Yeah. So we're out there walking the fence line every morning and catching the frogs very easily that are in the buckets. Many of them will be bloated. They'll have edema. And so that edema, as far as we can tell, it's occurring before they get to this pond. These animals spend a week or two in those ponds each spring to breed, and then they're out of there. So something is going on where they're getting exposed to something linked to salt, probably salt itself, possibly either as an effect of growing up in a salty pond and then having some dysregulation around their freeze popsicle traits in the winter, where they just don't clear that water, or they take on excess water, Or it may be something like they're eating a saltier diet. And as with humans, if you intake too much salt, you can experience edema. My first year here at Southern, they happened to be, I was just hustling and eating salsa and chips for most lunches and dinners, and just trying to get everything done. And one day I think I ate too much salt, and like my legs swelled up, and I saw my doctor, and he was like, "Did you eat anything salty recently?" And I was like, "Well, I don't think so. Just like a can of salsa and some tortilla chips." And he was like, "Yeah, that's a lot of salt." So I had this experience of edema myself. It wasn't my inspiration for studying it, but we do know that if you consume a lot of salt, your body will retain water.
Yeah.
And so we think that, there's these two kind of pathways that we hypothesize might be causing this problem. And it may be that both are occurring or one is more important than the other. But for a long time, I assumed that, it's got to be something to do with these animals as eggs and tadpoles growing up in a polluted environment. And I mentioned salt a lot, but there's all kinds of contaminants in these ponds. There's heavy metals. So that includes copper, zinc, cadmium, platinum, things that are on brakes. They're in exhaust systems. They're in tires. There's these complex carbon molecules that tires include. There's the breakdown products from fuels. There's oil. There's so much stuff in these ponds besides
I was going to ask you, how remote have you been able to go to test some of these populations and see the comparison between that very remote area and closer to the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and you say city, actually the places that we study are really rural to begin with. So we're looking at a road in Vermont that's like a beautiful country road that you might just enjoy a Sunday drive on peacefully. And there aren't a lot of houses around. Even those roads that are off in the middle of nowhere, they get salted. And so we think a lot of the signal that we're seeing is probably from salt. But those roads also have components in them like these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, these like complex molecules that we know cause developmental malformations. They can cause cancer. They can damage DNA. So there's a whole suite of things, even in a very remote setting, if there's a road nearby. And I think that's one of the really striking aspects of this study system is that there's been a surge in interest in like urban ecology in the last decade and a half or so. And we had been studying that in a slightly different way by looking at one aspect of urbanization, but roads are everywhere. So roads don't always lead to urban areas. So for us, we'll study these roads in relatively undeveloped settings. And that salt we find can travel about 175 meters away from the road. So for us, the sort of reference point to an undisturbed pond, at least in terms of pollution, we try to go at least 150 meters away from the road into the woods. And that's been our kind of comparison. We've also looked at kind of a grading effect of, not just close to the road or far from it, but how much salt do you see at those intermediate scales as well. So we don't have to go too far away from the road, but if you kind of zoom out, you can appreciate that roads cover a lot of the planet. They've been referred to as the spearhead of fragmentation and the sleeping giant of environmental change. They have big impacts, even when it's not a dense road network like we might see in a city.
Well, one of the things that I think is really interesting about all, and especially the way that you just talked about it is just the idea of, if we're thinking about studying it, it actually connects back to what we were talking about earlier, which was the idea of having this pressure to make connections and all that kind of stuff. But when we think about a lot of things like, particularly science and looking at, sort of one specific species and that sort of thing, we're basically talking about parts and wholes and a systemic sort of approach towards things. So looking at the way that this one species functions or is affected by the environment and that sort of thing can be extended out. And then we can start to look at, well, what is the whole ecosystem like and what's happening there? And then if we think about it, in this one case, then, is that extensible to the larger, sort of whole Northeast or whatever? So, I think that, it's very interesting that like while the focus could be very specific, it has this extensibility just naturally when you start to think about how is this situated within a whole system?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that that's, part of like studying communication and that kind of thing. That's, sort of where that's where I'm most comfortable, is thinking about this idea of communication systems, right? So that you have, conversations as sort of a micro unit, right? But then, how is that conversation situated in groups, and then larger organizations, and then society, and that kind of stuff. So that part whole kind of comparison is really kind of it's how I make sense of things to a large degree. But I guess the thing that in your discussion here, and sort of explaining, the different the pressures that environmental pressures that these frogs are experiencing, it seemed like it was very specific, but you touched upon so many other bigger issues.
There's so much going on out there.
Right. Because just talking about, tires and exhausts and like all these things, it just breaks up, it explodes into like all of these macro issues just by studying this one species. And I think that's particularly fascinating.
Yeah, it speaks to the challenge of the work that we try to do as scientists too, in identifying a cause. There are many causes in this case, we think. And so we try to understand the relative contributions of these different effects, how they interact. Things get really complex and difficult to study quickly when experimentally you're trying to test more than one or two different potential causal agents. So we did one experiment several years ago with an undergrad in my lab who was doing her honors thesis, and we were looking at the effects of salt, but we were asking this question about, kind of in the context of climate change, what happens as environments warm up? Is there going to be a more severe reaction to salt? And so that's really this idea that there might be an interaction between two different forces, that salt pollution and temperature individually might have effects on these animals. But what happens when you put them together? Is it simply the additive effect, or does one exacerbate the other? And we found that one of the more fascinating results for the general insights from our lab has been that those roadside populations, so these are ponds that are within 100 or maybe 20 to 50 feet of a road, anywhere in that range, they tend to get a lot of salt and quite polluted. We've done experiments where we've transplanted the frogs from those dirty populations, those dirty ponds, into nice clean habitat, and vice versa. And we call those reciprocal transplant experiments. And this is kind of the gold standard for testing the hypothesis that evolution over time should produce populations that are better adapted to their local environment than populations in other environments would be in that particular environment, right? So there's this kind of home team advantage that should evolve over time. And it's sort of the basis for most of the diversity on life, that environments change over time and across space, and populations adapt and diverge, and we have species adapted to different conditions, and at a smaller level, or at a lower sort of biological level, populations experience that same adaptation. So we expected that, okay, we're going to do these transplant experiments, and this is going way back to my graduate days. This was like my first experiment. We took these populations, individuals representing each population, and transplanted them. The idea being that, okay, well, if they're adapting, the home team should show an advantage when we compare the locals versus the transplanted individuals. And across the board, the home team for the roadside dirty ponds had the disadvantage. So it wasn't that there was a neutral effect where they were equally responding poorly to this environment, but if they came from a polluted environment, they were worse at surviving in it. And that was the first result I got as a grad student. And I was like, oh no, like, what do I do with this? This is not what I expected. It's not what anyone would expect.
Yeah.
And that's been really fascinating to try to figure out. I guess I can get back to that at some point, but when we brought in the temperature thing, we were asking this question like, okay, these animals are what we might consider kind of maladapted, at least at certain life stages, to these environments. They're not doing well there. And in fact, if we bring in animals from other environments, they do better in that environment. Why is that? When we added heat to the mixture, the home team did even worse. So it looks like on multiple fronts, these animals are in some way compromised by this environment in ways that span generations, or they're adapting in ways that might include trade-offs with something like survival at these embryonic stages. And so we've seen some evidence of that too. This general pattern of roadside ponds have this depressing effect on the populations. They don't survive as well, they don't grow as well, they don't develop as well, they have more malformations, it affects they get bloated, edematous, they don't jump as well. All of these problems occur associated with that. But we also see some signs of hope, or a little more positive aspect of the story, which is that the females in these ponds, even though their offspring don't survive very well as tadpoles, they lay more eggs. So there may be this compensatory effect where animals are increasing reproductive output. So they're investing energy into producing more eggs at lower quality. And we see that the females also jump further if they come from a roadside environment compared to the ones that come from these woodland environments. We think, and I have a grad student working on this right now very intensively to finish his thesis, that there may be natural selection that's favoring jumping performance to get across the road.
Yeah.
So have you ever played Frogger as a kid?
Yeah.
I actually just played this in the airport the other day at Logan. They had a free arcade there, and my son was playing Frogger, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is my job, basically. I can just stay here. But yeah, we think that there's all these things going on where there's this evidence that they're poorly adapted to the aquatic conditions, but they may be investing in strategies that allow them to adapt in ways that we're not quite picking up yet, that maybe include this locomotion pressure to get across the road, and laying eggs that there's more of them. We also found this really recently, this remarkable, what seems to be an adaptation, where the eggs that come from saltier ponds, so we gathered females from all these different ponds, distributed across this salinity gradient, so from low salt woodland ponds to high salt roadside ponds. And we measured the rate of water uptake by those eggs. So we just put the eggs in little pools of water, tiny little wells in the lab, and measured their weight before and after a couple days. And these eggs swell up very quickly. So these females lay about 1,000 eggs. So one of these little frogs has about 1,000 eggs. And when she lays those eggs, that whole mass is about the size of a golf ball. Within 2 days, it's like the size of a baseball or a softball. It swells up very quickly with water from the pond. And so we measured this rate of water uptake, and we found that the saltier the pond, the faster the rate of water uptake for these eggs. Whereas when you put an egg in salt water, the uptake rate is slower. So you've got these two things going on. The environment is suppressing the rate of water uptake when you add salt, but it appears that perhaps evolution is compensating for that by selecting for individuals that have higher rates of water uptake in their eggs. And so that's this cool phenomenon in biology we call counter gradient variation, where there's adaptations to counter the environmental variation to create more stability in the traits that emerge. So that may be part of the story too. We have all these kind of disparate pieces of the story. What we really need is like a 5-year large study with a lot of funding to run a big, long experiment.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
But I think that what it kind of gets at, though, and this is what I think is really fascinating about this, is when you're studying a complex system, right? There are so many different kind of variables that are involved, right? And how do you, it's not possible to like look at them all simultaneously, right? You have to, kind of isolate and kind of think about these things. But you've talked about all these different variations that are all related to salinity, but it's not it's not all about just that one thing, right? It's all these different dimensions. So I think that sort of creative sort of approach to it is trying to get an appreciation for how the entire system works. And I think that, and I just have a tendency to kind of do the pullback and, this is the whole whole thing going on there, right? And it's happening right in the conversation. So, but just thinking about that whole idea is, if we think about how science is done to try to understand complex systems, and then our social environment is such that we're looking for quick answers, right? So if you think about social media and that sort of stuff, it's basically saying, okay, well, what's the bite-sized answer? But there is no bite-sized answer if you're trying to study a complex system. And I think that that's also part of our larger conversation about science, is that it tries to make it simple when it can't be simple.
I bet that if we continue talking about this, it gets even more and more complex.
Right.
Because like when you started, you went straight into it like, well, I only researched this very specific thing, this very specific amphibian. And just like Dave, like I hear you speak and I'm like, this is not very specific. This just keeps getting bigger and bigger
There's a
and
lot
bigger.
of layers,
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating. And I think that that's part of what sort of confounds our current conversation around science right now, is the fact that we have a tendency socially to just kind of tune out the complexity or want to reduce the complexity. I mean, that's just a normal human reaction to lots of information. Like we're always trying to filter and so that we can make sense of things. But I think that we're moving more in the direction of having like these social mechanisms and pressures that are kind of forcing us into a position to expect that there's going to be one simple reason. And this is why, like, I mean, just to think of a simple analogy in my news feed, like I'm constantly getting, because I clicked once on something about high blood pressure or whatever, right? So now I get all these articles about, oh, this study just proved that this thing is, that if you, eat too much peanut butter, it's going to be bad for you. And then the next day I'll get an article that says, no, what we thought about peanut butter is completely wrong. And it's the completely opposite. And you should eat more peanut butter and, all this, that kind of stuff. And it's constant and it's daily.
It is.
And it's always about this one thing. So
Peanut butter.
Right. It could be, but it's all about the Reese's.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we have this kind of remarkable tolerance or crave for quick information, but a high tolerance for volume of that information with social media, right? Like we don't necessarily have the tolerance for depth. I don't know. I don't think a lot about this, but it seems to me that there's this need for like quick information and a lot of it, and just this sort of like scrolling habit of constant more information. And one of the many hazards, of course, is that the things you're talking about are effectively a soundbite, and that's what lands with people.
Yep.
The work of science takes years and years and decades and centuries, right, to figure things out.
Yep.
And misinformation, whether intentional or not, takes seconds to create and minutes to hours to spread, right? And so you can have this remarkably outsized impact on society by spreading information that has very little grounding and often is untrue, at worst, hurtful, damaging. Whereas science, like we need to understand, I think, as a society, that scientists, for the most part, are really good at what they do, and it takes a long time to get the information, and it's not going to be always satisfactory. It's not going to be the answer, and it's not going to be simple often. But that doesn't mean that it's not the best approach to understanding the natural world, because science is the best approach we have to understanding nature and learning about ourselves and the world we live in.
So with that in mind, that it takes years and years to research something and get responses, we always like to get a little background of our guests' trajectory in their career path. And I'm curious, was your path linear? Like you were talking about already experimenting with these frogs in grad school, but do you think about these frogs when you were a kid and you decided, I'm going to become a biologist and I'm going to study this? Like, how did that came about?
No way. And I love this question because I see myself as someone who took the least linear path of anyone I know and just kind of like barely made it by a thread. And it might all fall apart any second. Like the whole operation is just going to collapse in on itself. It's too much. And I've talked to folks about this. Like, how the hell did you go from like point A to point B so directly? And some people have that path, right? They know what they want to do early on. They work hard, they succeed, they have great opportunities, all of that stuff comes together. I guess as a kid, the closest I can come up with any sort of link to this is I spent a lot of time outside. And I didn't really like being indoors. And not to say I wasn't like a kid who also sat in front of the TV and ate a TV dinner and watched.
But we come from a generation where we didn't spend much time indoors. We didn't have video games. We were out and about. There was mostly parks.
Yeah.
And families going on adventures. Yeah. Like my dad loved road trips. I hate road trips now.
Funny how that works, huh? Yeah. For me, I don't know. I felt kind of uncomfortable indoors for the most part. I like some aspects of being indoors, but I just craved being outside. And the only thread I can see with the sort of like evolutionary question of human impacts is I remember as a kid wondering if the squirrels that were running across the road would evolve to run faster to avoid cars. And I didn't remember that until sometime in grad school when I was writing my dissertation. I was like, I did think about this once upon a time that maybe there's evolutionary responses to human activities. So I don't know. My path was very, as you said, it was not linear at all. In high school, I started doing everything under the sun. And I think you're talking about earlier this idea of like, I guess I was claiming that I don't do anything other than this one frog. But I also try to do a lot of different things. And I feel like I don't do anything, I don't excel in any one thing. And I've always tried to do lots of things like slightly above average. That's my standard for like, if I can. And I think it emerged as like a defense mechanism in high school where I was like, this is a way to make friends and to feel like people are interested in me. And I'm an intriguing individual because I was in the band and doing sports and doing the recycling club and I don't know, all these different activities. And I would spread myself really thin and take as many courses as possible with the goal of like doing pretty well and never specializing. And then I took that same mentality to college where suddenly you have even more options. And I was a biology major and also a music major. And I got about halfway through college and was like, I don't know, I feel like I'm not giving either one of these the attention I would like to. I was kind of questioning this spread myself thin mentality.
Yeah.
And I sort of flipped a coin. I was like, I'm going to just do music. And I think I chose that as a major over biology because it seemed like the less likely choice. I thought it'd be more surprising to people. They're like, oh, okay, like you don't want to go to med school? I'm like, and I wasn't a particularly good musician. Like I played trombone growing up and it's not like an instrument most people go far with.
Right.
And you can, of course, if you work hard and have the talent, but I just wanted to do all these different things. And so even in college, I was doing all these different activities. And I sort of chose the music path over the biology path and just allocated the biology effort as a minor. So I had graduated with a degree in fine arts and music and a minor in biology. And honestly, I probably spent most of my time in the theater. So like even the music thing that I was supposed to be doing, I was more interested in like writing plays and directing plays and that sort of thing than practicing music. And so often when I give a talk, if like a seminar at another university, if it's going to have undergrads in the room, I talk about this and I show a picture of me playing in a band with like white vinyl or polyester pants and a purple like polyester shirt and a trombone and this funk band. I was like, this is what I was doing while you're sitting here learning about biology. Like I was doing a million different things at the same stage in a career. And then after college, I ended up working in the same town that I went to school in, basically in Burlington, Vermont, for a little while. And then I went into Peace Corps and in Kenya. And that was a really fascinating experience. And I spent a lot of time outside and had a lot of time to read and think about what life meant and all of these kind of, I don't know, grounding questions, I guess. And there was a lot of environmental work that we were doing there and a lot of HIV education. This is back in 2002 and 2003. And so that experience kind of led me toward eventually, I think, getting into something in the conservation realm and thinking about environmental impacts and health. And I came back from Peace Corps. I worked at a gear shop in Vermont where I was just selling climbing gear and ski gear and climbing and skiing. That was my life, basically. I'd climb and ski. I think I wrote a play somewhere in that time. I was like still trying to dabble in the arts. And then eventually I was like, I don't know, like, I think I want to do something else. And then I was like, I'll apply to grad school. That seems like the next thing. And so I applied to 3 programs in the sciences and 1 fine arts program. Like, I still wasn't decided then on my career. And I can tell you right now, like, if someone offered me a position in the arts, I would take it. Like, I'm still not decided about my fucking career. Like, I'm ready to change. And not because I don't love the science, right? I do, but I have these holes in different directions. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I applied to three science programs and 1 fine arts program. I only got into 1 program. I had no guidance. I didn't know that you should apply to lots of grad programs. I thought graduate school was like, you just learn more. I didn't realize that you do research and try to contribute knowledge to the world. Mm-hmm. And so then I started a grad program at the Yale School of what was then called Forestry and Environmental Studies. It's now the School of the Environment. And I think they made a mistake by admitting me. I don't know how I got into the music major, but I think the Peace Corps background helped. But it was one of the best things that happened for me, that I got into this program and immediately felt this energy of being around all of these other folks who were excited to do something about the environment and try to learn about it and take action. And it was also this great community, which was something I experienced as an undergrad. I went to St. Michael's College. And if you ask most St. Mike's undergrads, probably the word that they would describe as their experience that captures it is something about community. Like, there was this wonderful community, and it meant so much to be a part of that community. And when I graduated, I felt disconnected. I felt lost and scared, and I was on my own in different capacities. And that was fine. But I also, when I got to grad school, I was like, oh, here it is. Like, this is that magic of being around people who you have excitement for common values and projects. And so, but my first semester in grad school, I audited Kiswahili. I took a business class, and then I took a couple ecology classes. So, like, I still, even in grad school for environmental science, like, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. And I just sort of got lucky. I fell into a lab because I had a work study position, and there was an opening in this lab where they studied frogs, and wood frogs in particular. And the PI, the principal investigator of that lab, was looking at the effects of forest practices on populations of wood frogs in northeastern Connecticut, where Yale has a big forest. And so I didn't know I knew basically nothing about science. I remember reading papers and seeing statistics and just being shut down. I was like, I don't know what a p-value is or an F statistic. I barely know now. But at the time I was like, oh my God, this is so very difficult. And but eventually, like, I adapted to that, and I got really excited about the frog stuff, and then applied to the PhD program a year and a half later, and stayed in the same lab and started doing my own research on frogs and salt pollution. And that doesn't lead me here directly. That experience was great, but I remember feeling really burned out by the end of it, and I was craving something else. And so my first postdoc position was with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and this particular group is based out of Woods Hole on Cape Cod, and it's one of the most beautiful places to be a scientist, or just to walk around, or to be out on the ocean. And they were studying whales, in particular right whales. So these are really large whales that have really diminished in their population numbers over time due to historical practices of hunting and current practices revolving around ships and collisions with ships and entanglement with fishing gear. And the last I checked, there was something like 400 of these animals left on the planet. So very, very endangered species. And the work we were doing there was to look at populations, to try to monitor the populations effectively using a variety of tools, including passive acoustics, where you go out and put microphones underwater and then recover the recording devices and analyze them for whale sounds. So I went from studying like these tiny tadpoles to these giant tadpoles, arguably, out in the ocean. And I was like, well, this is cool. Like, I'm in this beautiful place. I got to go out on like a 2-week research cruise out in the Atlantic Ocean looking for whales, and all really fun things as a biologist, but I was missing the experimental component of doing work with frogs, where you can actually test a hypothesis, manipulate conditions, and we have these really fascinating patterns happening that we wanted to answer. And so I was trying to find my way back to that, but I wasn't very successful for a while. So I had that postdoc position for 1 year, and I don't think I did a stellar job. I was like just not, I did my work, but I don't think I did enough to convince them to keep me on for another year. And so when the grant ran out, they were like, well, thanks. And I was like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, I get it. And I don't know, life was chaotic. Like my personal life was chaotic, and I had 2 young kids at the time and was trying to navigate all of these complex issues. And I ended up at that point being unemployed for, I don't know, like 6 to 9 months. So I had, arguably this like great education and this great trajectory, and then it just kind of fell off a cliff. And I didn't know what was going to happen. Like I was like, oh, am I going to be pumping gas? Like it was so stressful having young kids and not having a paycheck and being on unemployment. And eventually so in that interim time, I ended up kind of volunteering as a postdoc at Dartmouth College. Apparently they couldn't afford to pay me. It's a big university. No, I don't know. There was just no grants, right? Like I wrote grants and nothing panned out. And so, but for me, I was like, well, I think this is the right step. And I was fortunate to find a mentor who was like, yeah, you can like be a free postdoc in my lab. And he's a close friend of mine, and he was a wonderful mentor. And during that time, we ran a field experiment, we wrote a paper, so progress was being made. And somewhere in there, I managed to get another postdoc position at the University of Vermont. And that position was focused on writing software for population management in the context of hunting. So nothing I knew really anything about. I had some coding skills. Arguably, I shouldn't have been in that position because someone with better coding skills should have been in. But nonetheless, like I had that position, I got to do some teaching, and I certainly learned a lot and had a good experience there. And that kind of held things down for a couple of years. And I was applying to try to get faculty positions all along. And I maybe had 1 or 2 interviews, but no offers. And then eventually I applied for a postdoc position at Dartmouth and a permanent position out in Seattle at King County, where they have a wonderful science program to support management and conservation out there. And I remember it came down to the wire. I was like, had this interview for the postdoc position at Dartmouth and the interview for the position in Seattle. And I had to make a decision because I was offered the job in Seattle, and I was waiting to hear back from Dartmouth because that was my preferred choice. Sorry to the folks in King County, but I was trying to continue on the research front. And I was like runner-up for the job at Dartmouth. So I went to Seattle. So then I had this position as an environmental scientist, and the folks there are just absolutely phenomenal. It was kind of like being back in grad school. You're around all these people who are motivated to do good for the environment, to understand it, and to take steps to improve it and protect it. And that work was really focused on kind of grounded in salmon conservation and stream habitat restoration. And so we did a lot of stream monitoring and report writing and going to town meetings and advocating and working with policymakers. And it was really this intersection of science and policy that I think a lot of biologists kind of allude to, but I was lucky to get that on the ground experience of being in that world. But all along, I was really craving a position like I have now, where I could do research and run a lab and teach. And so I would spend my lunch breaks and my commutes working on papers. And I think that was kind of my big deficit on the job market, was I didn't have enough publications.
Right.
And so, yeah, I would take my lunch break and go work on a paper, and ended up publishing a bunch of papers that year, which I think got me competitive enough to get a position. So then eventually I ended up here, and that was now 9 years ago. So that's a tiny...
That is an incredible path, and I really wish we could explore that more, but we are running out of time.
Yeah.
And this always happens.
And I know. I could talk a lot more.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the communication stuff and all the things, like how the parts connect.
There's all kinds of things that we could talk about. Yeah. This was great. One of the things, I don't know, we didn't get a chance to talk about this, but you're also trying to start your own podcast, right?
I am trying to start my own podcast. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. So Jay in the studio was very generous with his time and helped me record one session on my own, and I didn't have this wonderful company to have a dialogue with. I was just speaking solo. That was interesting, challenging, but I'm really grateful to the time Jay put in and that I got to do that. The idea with this podcast is kind of like you were saying, in terms of getting at the arc of scientists and other maybe academic professionals, how they got where they are in their career. And so I guess the sort of 3 things I'm hoping for is that piece of a story for a scientist to talk about how they got where they are. what's exciting, like what have been the kind of highs and lows, but then I also want to have that intersect with personal journeys and struggles. And I think there's this impression, at least I've had this impression, that the most successful folks have it all going on and everything's perfect and their personal lives are just perfectly balanced and everything is good. And I want to hear the stories of what it's like to be a human who happens to be a scientist. And I think my hope is that it creates a more relatable, impression of professionals, and it will be good for students to see that, like, oh, this person's had challenges in their personal life as well, and maybe they can relate to them. So yeah, I hope we have some guests lined up and hoping to get a few sessions.
I can't wait to listen to it.
Cool.
It sounds amazing, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's just such a pleasure to chat.
Absolutely. We need to do our normal plugs for our own podcast.
But before we leave today too, I just want to let everyone know that we are going to be recording a session at the Bridging Pathways event that the Innovation Hub is hosting in a couple of weeks. It's going to be here at Southern, and we're really looking forward to talking to a bunch of Connecticut leaders in the manufacturing, business, and quantum fields.
Yes.
That sounds so interesting.
It's going to be an interesting day. The other thing that we need to also make a plug for is we're still in the market for interns.
Yes.
So
that's been quite challenging.
I might apply for that, actually. Keeping with my theme.
Well, now I know that you're willing to work for free.
That's right.
That's
thank
right.
you.
Yeah. If you are interested in an internship with our podcast and would like to know a little bit more about how this whole thing gets put together, how we make the sausage, so to speak, contact us at creativejpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use that same email to give us comments about the show and what you think of it. And if you have any topics that you'd like for us to address and cover, we'd be happy to entertain that. But as far as this episode, I think we're ready to stop.
Yes.
Finally. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching.
Thank you.
Creative Journeys is a podcast produced at Southern Connecticut State University by faculty, students, and staff who are interested in exploring our creative potential.